Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program, we're going to be talking about education. Yeah, I know this is 2012 and we're looking to elect another president of the United States or perhaps re-elect the one they've got. That certainly is on their pulpit to be talking to us about how it's a very important issue for us to follow and why we should be electing them. Education goes a lot deeper, though, and we're going to be discovering today just how much deeper it is as far as how we approach it and what it's all about. Our guest today has more than 40 years of experience, which also includes 2 years teaching high school, 20-plus years as a professor of biology, 4 as a counselor for elementary and intermediate school children with learning difficulties, and 20 years as an international consultant to more than 40 countries doing workshops and keynote presentations. I think she's got a lot more experience than our presidents, I would definitely have to say. Her book is Smart Moves, Why Learning is Not All in Your Head. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Carla Hannaford. Carla, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel.
What a fun book. I mean, this here, you take a look at Smart Moves and then Why Learning, and the next thing you think, okay, this is going to be one of those drab sort of things that you tend to almost find when it comes to learning and education. But this here is a very holistic approach that actually got me thinking to myself, no wonder I and maybe a lot of others are where we are. Not that that's all bad, but but now talk with us about what changed, I guess, your view in education some 40 years ago that led you to not only create Smart Moves, but how you approach education the way that you do in your book.
Well, it started personally.
Doesn't it always?
I was 10. Yeah. So if I were in school today, I would have been in special ed. Absolutely. I was a kid that needed to move, and I was real passionate and enthusiastic. But for some reason, I could not catch that patterning of how you read until I was 10. And then the next door neighbor had me taking care of her son, and she, in exchange, she was a first grade teacher. She taught me to read. And I'm not the only one that has had this problem. But my daughter also had the problem as she was growing up. And I realized that something needed to happen differently. And luckily, as a scientist, I was teaching at the University of Hawaii at the time. In my classes, my biology classes were real kinesthetically oriented. I loved the labs. We're a lot of hands-on, and we're learning through all of our senses. And I was using a thing called super learning, which is a beat a second music in the background. It's Georgi Lazarnov's work, and it was to help with language development. And you have a beat a second music in the background, and then you do kind of a visualization of things, of words. And of course, biology is Latin, so I was using it pretty well. So I did an in-service kind of for the community where I live, and one of the people in that was the principal for a grade school. And he said, I really want you to do this with my teacher. And then the intermediate school principal said, well, shoot, I want you to do this with these kids that are having a lot of problems. And it was called CSAP, Comprehensive Student Alienation Program. So I got to have a living laboratory. It was supposed to be a 9-week pilot project, and I was excited because as a single parent, my daughter was just going into the intermediate school. I thought, this is great. I'll get to be with her. She was mortified I would do this. But right before I started this project, I did two things. I took a Touch for Health class because in the 1970s when I was teaching in Denver at the university, they had given scholarships to all the nurses to do Touch for Health in the hospitals. And I was teaching a lot of nurses anatomy. The other thing is I took a brain gym class and also worked with adjudicated children. Actually, they were 13 to 18 years old in the summer, and really learned a lot. And the woman that taught me Touch for Health says, if you're going to work with these kids, you need to know. She showed me some pretty simple movements, just some cross-lateral movements like walking. It looks like walking, but it's touching the one elbow to the opposite knee and then the other elbow to the opposite knee, pressing the midline of the body. And she had me do thinking caps, which are unrolling the earlobes from top to bottom. I believe a yawn and massaging the temporomandibular joint. And then a thing called hookups, where you cross your ankles over standing, so you have to use balance. Then you're crossing your arms and rolling them under, kind of holding them on your chest with your fingers interlaced, putting your tongue on the roof of your mouth, breathing. And I thought, well, why not? So I had a beat a second music on in the background, and students that came to me. Now, one of the lucky things about this is I'm teaching full-time at the university and doing this 9-week pilot project and a single parent. So when they handed me the files of these students, I had no time to read them. So I had no preconceived notions about who they were. And again, as a scientist, that's really important to know.
Sure.
So as these kids came in, I'd ask them what they needed and kind of, I'd have a beat a second music on in the background, which helps to increase alpha brainwave activity. And I had them do these movements. A week and a half later, here comes the English teacher. What are you doing with Jessie? Oh, a little of this and a little of that. And I said, why? And she says, you don't know about Jessie? And I said, don't. Tell me. And when he came in, I thought he's older, but I didn't know for sure. And sure enough, he was 17.
Wow.
In intermediate school. And he was
17
tall.
in intermediate school?
Yeah. He'd
wow.
been held back and held back and held back. So he was 2 years behind all the rest of the kids. And the reason she came to me is he had offered to read. Well, when Jessie came in to meet with me, I said, what do you want to do? What are you working on? He said, well, I guess I need to work on reading. Great. What are you interested in? And he said, motorcycles. Back in the 1960s, I had a 650 Norton. So we got on, and so we went to the library and we got a magazine about motorcycles, and I worked with his reading, and he was doing these movements, and I had seen him twice, is all. He had offered to read in the English class. And then I started getting these other students, the other teachers of these students coming to me and saying, well, and then the principal came and said, would you show us what you're doing in-service for the teachers? And I said, sure, you do a few of these movements. And then I needed to know what was happening here. Why were these kids doing so well? And so I started taking these classes. Brain Gym it's an offshoot. Dr. Dennison put together information from all sorts of areas, yoga and applied kinesiology and cranial sacral work and just different things, but simple movements that work. So I showed him these few things, and then I needed to know. And I took all these classes, and I ask all these hard questions. Okay, neurologically, what's going on here? And everybody would say, oh, just trust, it works. Well, you don't say that to a scientist,
Right.
especially a neurophysiologist. So then I started digging, and there wasn't a lot. I don't know if you remember this, but the 90s were definitely the decade of the brain. There was all this stuff about the brain, and the body wasn't important. Anything below the neck was caused problems. But there were some studies that were really interesting to me, and I started really studying this. And by the mid-90s, I came out with Smart Moves, the first edition of Smart Moves, with as much research as I could get on how important movement was. And, of course, now, everywhere you look, it talks about body-mind.
Right.
Yeah. So there's this huge shift that has occurred. And part of it occurred because in the 1999, Gerd Kepperman and Fred Gage discovered that we grow new nerve cells until the day we die. And we grow, what they saw is the growth in the hippocampus of the brain, which has to do with memory. But since then, there have been multiple researches showing that we're growing new nerve cells along the spine, we're growing it along the track to the nose, the olfactory lobes, and other places. So we are growing new nerve cells till the day we die. And Henrietta von Prague, in Marion Diamond's laboratory at Berkeley, see, they had discovered, Marion Diamond is like the real grandmother of enriched environments at Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And she was saying the best way to learn is with enriched environments. And they were using rats to find out, how do you make rats really smart?
Well, no, we're not talking attorneys. We're talking actual rats. I just want to be sure to the listeners that they understand, they are rats, although, they found out that attorneys were willing to do things that rats weren't.
Right. Rats were smarter.
Because attorneys would stop growing the nerve endings, and that's why they had to use rats.
Maybe that's the reason. Well, so what they discovered is an enriched environment with fresh air, good food, playmates, toys, and, space. Well, Henrietta von Prague decided, because they were finding out like 20 years earlier that these rats were growing new nerve cells till the day they died. And so now all of a sudden we've got humans growing new nerve cells. And, we looked at the research and said, nah, we're not rats. But here it was. So Henrietta started taking apart the different aspects of an enriched environment. And what she discovered is the thing that really grew the nerve cells, the new nerve cells, were running wheels. Cross-lateral integrated movement, running. So this was huge in the scientific community. All of a sudden the body was sort of important. And there was an article in January, February, Scientific American Mind, that claims these body movements, our sensory motor function, is actually cognition, not the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're looking at now in the research is that brain is not that important. Anyway, the neocortex of the brain is not that important. If someone loses their hippocampus or they lose the thalamus, where the thalamus is where all this sensory information comes through, function.
Right.
You just can't function. And go into a coma. And those are kind of the lower levels of the brain. The cerebellum, you lose your cerebellum, you're gone. But you lose the neocortex. And there have been, in the United States, there's well over 1,000 people that have had hemispherectomies, where they've taken out the right or the left hemisphere. And these people function fine.
And interestingly enough, Carla, many years ago, when we were talking about the brain and how when you keep learning new things, that the brain sort of reinvents itself, that there was a study of nuns, and they actually found one particular nun, I believe, was into her 90s, and it was discovered that she actually was missing half of her brain and was somehow highly functional because of the brain's ability to adapt and continue to grow, which I found quite amazing, which seems kind of contradictory to what we believe we know.
Right. And the other thing with that nun study that I thought was quite interesting is the nuns had given approval for them to have their brain studied when they died. And some of those nuns were over 100 years old. And these were nuns. There was two different groups. There were the nuns that were teachers, and even up into their 90s and 100s were teaching, and they were fighting with each other over political issues, and they were doing a lot of shuffleboard, and they were doing Scrabble and all sorts of things, And then there was the other group of nuns that were just the housekeepers. And so they did a study with these two groups. What was interesting is that many of those nuns that were the teachers had some of these tangles that you get with Alzheimer's, but never had any of the symptoms.
Wow.
And they were brilliant. They were brilliant until the day they died. And their brain mass, the number of nerve cells were greater. So then the group that had just been doing the same menial chores over and over and over again weren't doing things that were novel. So, here's another study I think that's interesting for us that are over 50. A huge study in science that found those people that danced once or twice a week, and they were working with people that were 70 to 95 years of age. Those that danced once or twice a week decreased their chance of Alzheimer's and dementia by 79%.
My goodness.
Yeah, and those that took up a musical instrument decreased it by 69%.
Now think about that, Carla. Those are huge numbers that you tend to never really hear about in connection with Alzheimer's disease as a means of prevention or even perhaps even a therapy if you're moving into those stages.
Right.
And yet it's something we can all do that's affordable.
Right.
Well, most of us anyway. We're not talking about people that might have some physical handicaps that could prevent them somewhat or perhaps even entirely, but.
But movement, movement of any part of the body is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And so here were these kids moving, and we have just found that movement's essential. I mean, every issue of ARP that I get, AARP, talks about the simplest movement you can do is walking. You know that walking just will stop people from being depressed because it activates both hemispheres of the brain, and takes away that area in the frontal lobe, in the prefrontal cortex of the right side where we kind of dig the hole that gets deeper and deeper when we're in depression. But back to education. So here's education. And what have we done? We, unfortunately, in our educational system, and we are basically a British system, and I work in 40 countries worldwide, and everywhere there's a base of a British system. There is major problems right now with educating our children.
No kidding. As you read Smart Moves, again, I started thinking of my own childhood. And believe me, it wasn't easy sometimes in school, even though there were areas that I would just blast through and become brilliant. And then other times, I was the kid who was punished quite often for, back in, the early 1970s, it was ADD, that kind of a thing. But I started questioning, how did we, especially, and it seemed like mostly in America, as you read through this, did we develop the kind of educational system or the approach to education that we have? Because it does one of, a myriad of things, but I was thinking, you condition a child to become someone who flourishes in life and in society, or you condition a child running the same course as this other child that flourishes, and that child can end up in prison.
Right.
Yet within the same educational system, you stand a chance of either one of those two things happening. And it's alarming. But back to what you were saying about the British system you discovered, where it touches in these different countries that you had been into.
Yeah, the statistics are showing that over 90% of our students in school have learning difficulties. Well, learning is the most natural thing we do as humans.
At least it was, nearly 1 million years ago as the species came on the planet, and all of a sudden we threw science in and we can't figure it all out now. But anyway.
Yeah, it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
So what have we done? We've taken out the movement programs, the physical education programs, or limited them, a lot. And we've taken out music, and music is huge because the first part of the brain to develop has to do with movement and sound. Very first part, in utero. It gives us the patterns that help us understand our life. So we've taken out an art. We have all these statistics that show that with standardized testing, those students that have art and music in the curriculum or in their lives do far better than the students that don't. We also are, one study after another is coming out now of the kids that are in physical education or in dance or in drama where they're moving a lot do far better in education than the ones that don't.
Mm-hmm.
I know up in the Michigan school system there's some schools now that are having students in the high school anyway stand up. They have the desks that are high so they can stand up, and they have little pedals underneath, like, the treadle pedals on a old sewing machine, so they can move their feet. And they're doing so much better. And instead, it's been interesting for me because I've put grants out there, and I've lost 2 grants that have asked for computers. So here these computers are coming into the schools instead of movement. And very sad, and we have a greater and greater crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And the stress that we have, let me just talk to this for a moment. I was, I think in the other program I talked about this too. I had done a in-service for Waldorf School in San Francisco. They had just been interviewed by the BBC, and there's a series coming out about the Waldorf schools, but these Waldorf schools especially, the ones that are in Silicon Valley. Here are all these parents in this Waldorf school sending their children to Waldorf school when the parents themselves are working in Silicon Valley on computers all day. These particular Waldorf schools do not allow television or computers in the home until at least the age of 11. Because the Waldorf idea is you have to develop those early skills base and a global understanding of the world before you start working on technology that is very linear. And, they're talking about the fact that, well, I get this from people, but we want our children to be way ahead of the game, so we give them computers very early. The learning curve on a computer is simple. Even I can run them now.
Yeah, and the way that I use it, believe me, it's extremely simple.
It's real simple, there's no big learning curve. But they say, well, people like Steve Jobs and stuff, what about him? Well, he grew up on a farm, and he grew up in the forest, where he was working with nature and really got a global view of the world. And when he came to the computer, it was very different than the way kids come to the computer today.
Oh, by leaps and bounds. I actually read his biography, The Journey is the Reward, which was the first one produced about him. And you're exactly right, and that's what they don't understand, is they mistake what we view and experience today as to that being what he experienced in his day, and they're completely different. What he experienced was the actual pieces, components, and the beginnings of what we know as the computer today, actually putting it together, building it, thinking of improving it so that people could learn to use it. It was sort of like having the idea of a car with an engine and literally how do we put this together so that anyone else can use it. And that's a huge learning curve versus, like you said today, you plug it in, you turn it on, you make sure the modem's running, and you search the Internet. There's really not much to it.
No, there's not. There's no creative aspect, and especially if you haven't developed those early creative learning skills. It's interesting. There's a book out, and I don't have the name of it right here, but the Kaiser Foundation discovered that youth today are spending an average of 11 hours a day on media, and that's, their phones, their smartphones, they're, doing different things, and the computer and the television and video games and things like that. And what we're doing is dumbing them down. We're training them to work on an assembly line. And what they see physiologically is this thing called a reactive brain, where they're in survival. There's high levels of adrenaline and cortisol, and they're constantly, they can't focus. The phone rang, I got to listen to it here, I've got to Twitter here, I've got to,
And I've got to hold it in my face just in case I might miss any of those things.
Right.
Rather than the bus that's about to run me down as I step off the curb because I didn't see it coming.
Yeah. There's no downtime.
Right.
They have no downtime where they can focus. And it's the downtime, and we're looking at this now, and they don't sleep well either because they are in this reactive brain. We're looking at the fact that sleep is essential, and especially this deep sleep, when we go way down into delta sleep, where we are seeing sparks in the brain that go from the hippocampus to the rest of the body and brain, and it's the anchoring of long-term memory. It's interesting to me, in China, everybody takes a nap. And they go into these deep states of sleep where they download their iPod, their hippocampus, into their body for long-term memory. And we've just taken naps out of the kindergarten in Hawaii. I can't believe it. And in China, everybody takes a nap, all the way up through high school, even the teachers, for half an hour.
As a matter of fact, too, Carla, as I had been overseas, especially over in European countries like Spain, for instance, and even in South America, they have their moment of the siesta, where they actually shut this town down. It could be 11 o'clock or 12 noon, and it's down until like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, you can still go to stores, but you could feel the town is really shut down. I mean, people are just chilling out. France is wonderful. We were talking with a gentleman who wrote a book titled Le Deal, where he set up the the outlet concept in France. And he says, in America we like to micromanage and move things along. And he says in France, they don't even think about moving anything along until after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I thought, my ideal of being leisurely and approaching business, was all wrong. In America it is, But apparently in the rest of the world, they're like, what the hell is the hurry? This is supposed to be a lifestyle. But, yeah, I can see what you're talking about.
And now in Japan, they're looking at the importance of naps, too, in factory workers. It's really important. We as adults should be taking naps every day, these cat naps. Oh, to stay clear.
Mm-hmm.
And they even found with high school students that they need more than, us adults, and that maybe high school students shouldn't be going to school until about 10 o'clock in the morning.
You know, Carla, that was my attitude as a high school student. No, it was like this. I remember it was by my junior or senior year, I think it was, and I wasn't, a stellar student by any means, but I got to a point where they said, you're ahead enough in your credits that you can come for half a day or you can actually graduate early, but I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself for most of the day, really? And we live sort of out in the country. And I said, well, I'd like to go half a day, and so I would actually go in at, when school started at 8:30 in the morning, and I was done by noon, and I flourished, But when I had to go in at 8:30 in the morning, and I had to be there until, taking, 6 or 7 classes until 3:30 in the afternoon, quite frankly, there would be times that I'd show up around 9 or 10 wishing, I wished I could go to school at this time because I would never skip.
Right. Right.
And boy, did I skip a lot too. So.
It follows the proper circadian rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a really important thing, and we really need to be honoring those circadian rhythms in our children, but also in ourselves. What else? I had talked about, since I'm kind of talking about computers for a moment, there was a huge study done in Germany where they found that with children early on computers, that it's a 0 and 1 mentality. It's a linear mentality. They couldn't think outside the box. They couldn't think globally.
Mm-hmm.
And what else with regard to this technology that we have right now in schools? And so many schools are having the kids take tests online or do their homework online. And I even went into a first grade class the other day, and all the kids had iPads. Couldn't believe it, But one of the things that happens is they're seeing this big study again with intermediate kids that cannot read body language or read facial expressions of another person. And the most information we get from another person, the most learning we get from another person is through body language.
Right.
And they are totally missing the body language because they've been texting and they're not looking at another person.
Mm-hmm.
The most complex, thing that we do is when we're talking to another person, we are actually, the muscles of our face are actually aligning and contracting with the muscles of the face of the person we're listening to in order for us to understand their emotions. There's a big study on this with people that had Botox, where you have that botulinum organism in there that paralyzes the muscles, and those people could not understand the emotions of others and could not feel the emotions. This is how we develop empathy and altruism and compassion and understanding, I think, to learn from other people.
Mm-hmm.
So, just what do we need in our education? We need the arts. Important.
Carla, it's so true when you were talking about how we seem to be so technology-driven, and as a result, you can see that not only are today's generations not able to read body signals, facial signals, but their ability to communicate ideas really has become limited too. For instance, when this generation, and I don't mean all of them because there are a lot of great kids that just, there really, really is, but what you tend to see is when they become frustrated or angry, they can't express ideas well because of their linear thinking, I guess, if you will.
Yeah.
So what you hear is foul language and even physical acting out. Whereas you try to say, well, look, do you ever notice this person who's calm over there and expressing these ideas seems very difficult to challenge just because of that fact alone. And language, the verbal language itself is a point now. There is no eloquence or expression. These were things that used to be huge in the early part of this century. Yeah,
Right.
this was a big thing. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of hit just on that for a moment in the early part of the century as compared to where things are today. And this even goes back to even as I was in school, and perhaps you were too, and that is, it seems that in education, when it comes to school, we tend to send our kids out as early as we can into basically what becomes a battlefield. And they're all on their own and ill-equipped, and parents seem to consistently say, well, this is the way it's done, and that this is a system that tends to have the one-shoe-fits-all situation. As you mentioned earlier in the program, it tends to take the approach of we complement the logical thinking type person. So these are people that think more logically, left side, math and reading, things like that. And so at early developmental stages, not all children are going to be that way. And you can see where it begins to really have a very alarming effect of why, if we continue doing this way, that you can end up either the child will flourish into society and do well, or end up in prison. Who knows?
Right.
And it's really interesting when you talk about, for instance, the basics, reading and writing, that we force these skills on children, and not all of them are going to get it at certain times. And you were doing comparisons in the United States how we approach this versus, for instance, in Africa or in Denmark. And I'd kind of like you to draw some contrasts between the United States and then those two other countries to show why what they do, flourishes so much more. It really goes hand in hand with nurturing versus pushing them out, and either your child's going to get it or there's something developmentally wrong with them if they don't.
Right. Well, Denmark, has held as being the top education system in the world for at least the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is per capita, there is more important science and there's more important art that comes out of Denmark than any other country in the world. And so you look at their system, it's real interesting. First of all, and a lot of the other Scandinavian countries also have adopted this system.
Mm-hmm.
They pay for the parent to stay home, at least one parent, for about 2 years. And so usually the parents trade off. 1 year the mother, the next year the father. And they are paid what they would normally get paid in their work. And then they have job security when they go back.
Wow.
Because what they find is then they don't have to pay for prisons on the other end.
There you go. So I was right
developing
about the potential of conditioning.
Right. So they're developing that security with the child and the connection that is so vital in those first 2 years. Then, free, they have these kindergartens. And about half of the children in Denmark go to what's called a forest kindergarten. The others go to other kindergartens till about the age of 6. They would never dream in those kindergartens of having those children write, print, or do reading. They don't, because the system isn't ready. Physiologically, the body is not ready for it. The eyes aren't ready. The hands aren't ready.
Mm-hmm.
So what do? The forest kindergartens I love. These children are in the forest 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, no matter what the weather. The forest kindergarten actually developed in Germany. Frederick Froebel, almost 150 years ago, noticed that children are getting sick, and he said they need to be outside. And so here are these kids outside in the weather. And the children are learning from the forest, and they're learning from each other. Most of the time is spent in unstructured, unadulterated play. And we know, right, Jock Penniscap is one of our great neurophysiologists today, and he says there are neurons in the brain that are developed for nothing but rough and tumble play. It helps to activate the whole system, and we get all that sensory motor input that helps us grow so well. So here are these children, they're developing their vestibular system, their sense of balance, and it's remarkable. I love the forest kindergartens. I talk a lot about them in my books. And then when they go to school, usually about the age of 6, 6.5, 7 sometimes, then the way they start to read is by writing. And they write in cursive, because cursive is whole brain, and it's easier on the hand that isn't fully developed. The carpals of the hand take a long time to develop. Our hand is our greatest tool, and it doesn't fully develop until about the age of 21. And so especially that grip with the thumb, the opposable thumb and the fingers, and they're doing cursive writing. And what the teacher will say is, write me a story. And so these children write their stories, and it's in cursive. The teacher can't read it, but the kids can. And so the kids read the stories to the teacher, and the teacher goes, wow, you really like horses. And they go, yeah. And so the teacher will say, you want to see how I write horse? And they want to, because that's what they're attempting to mimic. So the teacher will write out horse in cursive. Well, the next story, it shows up all through the story. And then they read their stories to their friends, and so horse shows up in their friends' stories because they've now got this word. And this is how they learn to read. And it's contextually stuff that's important for them. Then, as they get into age 7 or so, the teacher will say to them, what are you interested in? One kid will say maybe, I'm interested in cats, and another might say, well, I'm interested in galaxies. And so then these kids work together. The ones that are interested in cats will get together, and they'll work on learning all about cats. They go to the library, they don't use computers early. And they'll go to the libraries, and they'll go to information, and they draw pictures about cats, and they make up stories and songs about cats. And then at the end of 9 weeks, they teach the whole class about cats.
Carla, if I might stop you right there just on that, because the example you gave in your book was, I see a dinosaur. And I found that interesting because that was exactly what triggered me. And my mother, dropped out of high school at the age of 16 to have me. So, formal education certainly wasn't her forte, but it was because of that she says, let's get a book on dinosaurs. And at first she started having, a rough and tumble time trying to pronounce some of these names. And dinosaur names are pretty complicated, actually.
Yeah.
And it got to a point, because of my voracious appetite for the subject, that I began to teach her how to say the names. And I was the kid that was underneath the covers at night with big, thick, scientific bounding type books from the library, 3 or 4 at a time, just tearing these things up. So I could totally relate to what you're talking about here.
Yeah. It has to be interesting. So, here are these kids. And I always say to the teachers, I do a lot of in-services in schools, and I say, okay, teachers, when did you learn what you teach? When we taught it. Well, of course. So what do? You get the kids teaching it, and they're going to learn it, And so then they teach to each other. And then there are no tests until the age of 14.
Right.
Which is really key. And by the way, these children, it's based on Rudolf Steiner's work, so the Waldorf kind of work. So the teachers follow the children through to about the age of 12. So you've got a community, you've got a family. And the teachers know how the kids are doing, so they can work with them individually and see their gifts, all their gifts. And the classrooms are noisy because the kids are working. But, I've been in quite a few of these classrooms in Denmark, and the minute, the teacher would say students, they have to be silence. They were ready to learn something from her. And by the way, when the kids are working on cat or galaxies, the teacher would then pull out language that has to do with galaxies and cats, and would work with math that had to do with galaxies and cats, so that really contextually very, very important, thematically important. Then at 14, they would take these skills tests that we're always giving our kids, unfortunately, and earlier, but, language and math tests. But nobody got a grade because everybody was perfect, right?
Right.
So it was like, oh, you're a little weak in this part of math, work on that. So that gives you inspiration to keep going, And then when they became 16, 17, or 18, when they were ready to graduate from school, they would tell the teacher, okay, I'm ready. And they would put together a test group. And oftentimes it's a parent and some peer students and the teachers. And that group would make up their final exam. Now this is what their final exam was. This group would come up with usually a piece of literature or a piece of art, or a piece of literature and a piece of music, or a piece of art and music. And the job of this student was to take these and discuss them in relationship to each other, historically, biologically, geologically, mathematically, through the society at that time, and write it in 2 languages. And they had a month to do it. And then the committee would decide whether they'd graduate or not. And I've seen some of these, and they were like master's theses in the United States.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of deductive reasoning.
I was just thinking, Carla, what it would be like to be in a Danish society, for instance, the way that modality operates, to listen to the language around education versus the way we experience that very same language here in America. Now, I know that I can, relate it from a perspective, and believe it or not, I've actually heard, teenage children say this. I want to graduate from high school so that I can get a good job. I want to go to college, and you hear this even in our political debates. We want continuing education, formal education, so that people can get better paying jobs. They always seem to relate education with jobs and work. And from what you describe about the Danes and the Swedes, is that they don't tend to view it that way, but they tend to say education is about self-learning and about you having a life that you feel fulfilled in, that you enjoy, right, that you continually grow in. Right. There's a huge contrast difference there between the two.
There is. And the thing about
makes you just want to set the reset clock back and say, can I go there and start, in school?
Yeah. What was interesting for me, too, is these students. Last time I was there, I did a talk for these 11-year-olds, and I couldn't believe the questions they came up with. They were brilliant. They were thinking deeply. They really had, they were coming up with solutions and deep thoughts, and I was just amazed. The other thing, too, is that I think, if we are educating our children to work and have a successful life, we need to look at the data around that. And in Smart Moves, I have a study that was done with the top CEOs of 12 companies in the United States, what they wanted in a workforce. And what they talked about was what they called the Agile Learner, that we would call an Agile Learner. And, they said numeracy and literacy was important, and understanding technology was important, basic technology. But more important than all of that was, and I'm attempting to turn to that page in my book.
This is part of a brain gem exercise for the listeners out there.
Yeah.
When you're discussing a particular subject that comes out of a particular book, see if at the same time you're discussing it that you can turn to that exact page while keeping the conversation going lively and interesting. And
multitasking.
For those of you tuning in, we're talking with Carla Hannaford. Her book is Smart Moves, Why Learning is Not All in Your Head. And I encourage all of you out there to go and get this, so then that way you don't start cutting not only yourself but your children off as well from the possibilities of growth and nurturing when it comes to learning, which should be fun for all of us.
What's interesting is all this research is out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's out there, and yet somehow the administrators in the school or the school board are missing it. So I always advise parents, get out there. You're the expert on your children.
Mm-hmm.
Really look at this research and go to the schools and make the changes.
Mm-hmm.
It can happen.
And Carla, too, when you talk about, administrators, all of a sudden now teachers, and I'm just going to use just America as an example because I'm not as familiar with the outside educational systems as you present here in Smart Moves, but that they've come to a level where now all of a sudden they're psychologists and doctors. And why I bring that up is the idea of ADD, ADHD. Again, I was one of those children back in the early 1970s. They said, well, we believe he's this, because I was pretty much a restless, somewhat disruptive kid, although I was very good at learning things and very quick. But, the alarming part about that is there was a moment that I was taking this, was supposed to be a full pill, but, they ended up cutting it down to half because of the power of it. And then my mother finally said, this is nonsense. If you have to send him home, I'd rather have him at home than becoming a zombie on this nonsense.
Right.
And so she cut that off. Thankfully, even with the limited education, if you will, that my mother had, she seemed to really have a lot of common sense in the approach of education, And so, thank for that. But I've actually encountered, I remember many years ago as I was working in a particular restaurant as a bartender, that there was a waitress who would bring her son in, and he was probably around 7, 8 years old, and he'd run around the restaurant a little bit when things were slow, but I could see and piece together she was a single mother. Mm-hmm. And he was just a boy at 7 or 8 years old and felt very comfortable in the environment to do that. Eventually, there came a time where the teacher, literally from the story I was hearing from her, was saying, your son's ADD, we need to get him on, these drugs to calm him down. And I said, please, whatever you do, don't do that. And I said, I know ADD, and I'm looking at your son, and I'm saying, this is why I believe he is the way he is. And your teacher's not a trained psychologist. Mm-hmm. She's not a trained psychiatrist. Your teacher is just a teacher. Right. And don't do that because it can have long-term devastating effects.
And it can. In my book, I talk a lot about those dexamphetamines. And I think there's more of an education around them now than there ever has been, and people have stopped them. But we see no advancement in these people that have been on dexamphetamines. In fact, many of them have real severe problems all throughout their lives. So, but it doesn't help learning.
Mm-hmm.
But here was, what is the Agile Learner? What do they want? These CEOs want in their companies. They want people that are flexible, creative, introspective, curious, imaginative, adaptable, aesthetically aware, ambiguity tolerant, and that acts with integrity. They want people that interpersonally can celebrate diversity, are altruistically motivated, effectively interdependent collaborators and team players.
All of which doesn't take an MBA to have.
This is what they want, because right now, think about this. They're saying that the jobs people will have in 10 years, between 70 and 80% of those jobs haven't even been invented yet.
Of course not.
So we have to have people that can think outside the box. And, how do we do that? We really honor our children, their different learning styles. We get them moving. We make sure the arts are in the curriculum. We don't push reading. William Glasser says we only learn 10% of what we read, but we learn 85% of what we experience physically and emotionally. So important. So, and I work with a lot of teachers, and I really believe teaching is one of the hardest professions on the planet.
Oh, yes.
And I really admire these teachers, and they are the experts. They do see that Ritalin doesn't help, the dexamphetamines don't help these children. And they do see that the children need movement and music. And, they're doing their best to do that around all of these things that are laid down by, No Child Left Behind. You have to, mark all of these things about this kid, and so
sort of beat the obstinance out of them, in other words.
It's just crazy. It's just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And, the research is out there. So knowing the research and taking affirmative action on it, really getting out there and saying we need to really educate our people. But how do we do it? We start from the base up. We start with security. We start with imagination, curiosity, and we model that for our children.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's so vital for our listeners to understand about your book, Smart Moves, Why Learning is Not All in Your Head, is you can approach this if you have children or grandchildren, and you can say, maybe I should pick this up and, take a look at what Carla has to offer. But at the same time, this is extremely valuable for people who are now perhaps in midlife, trying to do that little dig where they change who they are about what they've been doing in life so that they can move toward a more fulfilling life. And it certainly doesn't bear the title Secrets or Steps to a Better Life. This is just smart moves.
It's smart moves. It's move, do things that are novel, get out there and be your curious, passionate self. Really live life.
Mm-hmm.
That's what our job is.
And if you could take from Steve Jobs, as you brought up earlier, it isn't about the computer. If you pay attention, he really didn't build the computer. He was the one that was an innovator about how things worked. Right. For instance, now you've got the plug in the computers that pulls away. He recognized that over in Asia that they actually had those pull-away magnetic cords for the rice steamers. And that was a way that if you happen to walk along, because they have a lot of those plug-in, steamers for making rice, that if you struck this cord with your foot, it just automatically broke away so it didn't pull the rice thing off of the counter. That's innovative, so he applied that to the computer. Just all these things, and you think, geez, he's such a genius, and it's like, if you actually read and understood this man, we're all geniuses. We just need to nurture that. The book, what was the one that I was just really excited about this time last year? The Talent Code says the same thing. You put a book like yours against those, and you realize we all had genius waiting to be awakened. All of us have it. It just depends on what is yours and where do you want to put it in the world, And it's just amazing, amazing stuff. Now, Carla, do you have a website people can find out more?
I do. And it's simply www.carlahannaford.com. Very simple.
carlahannaford.com. The book is Smart Moves, Why Learning is Not All in Your Head, and I couldn't agree with you more. Carla, what a pleasure to have you on the program again today.
Thank you, Daniel. You have a great day.
You too. We encourage you, the listeners, find out more about Smart Moves. Also be sure to make a smart move toward our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do have a free weekly e-newsletter. Be sure to sign up for that as well. We'll have a hot link there to the book Smart Moves and Carla Hannaford's site as well on our blog. We thank you again for tuning in. This is Beyond 50. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.